Welcome everyone to the Hebrew session of the Rimon Festival for Jewish Languages. Just one quick thing I didn't say. The reason why we call it Rimon, it's because all Jews understand what Rimon is in all their languages. It's a very sacred, very important, very ancient symbol of Judaism. You know, it reminds us of the mitzvot, etc. But it also reminds us of diversity. We Jews, different Jews from different places of the world, are like different seeds, but we're still contained within the same fruit. So we're very happy you're here with us to get to know the other seeds within our fruit.
Great. So now I'm going to introduce to Dr. Aaron David Rubin, who will be talking about the history of the Hebrew language. And he's currently the Malvin and Leah Bank Professor of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies, Jewish Studies and Linguistics at Penn State University. And his main area of study is the Semitic language family, focusing on Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, and the modern languages of Southern Arabia. Well, if you want to learn more about other Jewish languages that we don't have the opportunity to present in this festival, please buy his book, his and Lily Kahn's book on Jewish languages from A to Z, and it's very comprehensive and really, really interesting. So thank you very much. Baruch haba, Aaron.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Tamara asked me today to give you a brief history of the Hebrew language and to give you some important basic facts about the language and possibly pertaining to some myths that you may have heard about Hebrew. I don't know, of course, all of your background, so I apologize if I say things that you already know. Hebrew is rather unique among the world's languages because we have record of Hebrew for about 3,000 years. And of the world's 6,000 or so languages, 99.9% of them have been written down only in the last century or two. So it's really rare to have a language written with any long period of written history, and only a very, very few languages have records of that are as long as Hebrew, 3,000 years. English, for example, has been written down for about 1,300 years, so less than half the time that Hebrew's been written down. So Hebrew really is quite special and interesting. The first thing I want to talk about is the language family that Hebrew belongs to. I'm going to share my screen here and share some slides. Tamara, I'm not able to share the screen at the moment.
So you're not being allowed to share the screen? Wait 1 second. You should be now.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Can you see my blank blue screen? Okay. So, as you may know, all but a very few of the world's languages can be grouped into families of languages, meaning that the members of that family all derive from a common ancestor. So, for example, the Romance language family includes languages like Spanish and French and Portuguese and Italian, and they all evolved from a common ancestor, in this case, Latin. English is part of the Germanic language family, along with languages like German and Dutch and Swedish and Icelandic. The common ancestor of that family, unlike Romance, is not attested, but we presume some common ancestor of English and German and the other members of the family. So Hebrew is part of a family that we call the Semitic family. The name Semitic comes from the Bible. One of Noah's sons was named Shem. And according to the genealogy in Genesis chapter 10, Shem was the ancestor of the Hebrews and the Arameans, among others. And so linguists gave the name Semitic to this family about 200 years ago. And you can see here on the screen some of the members of this family, including languages like Akkadian, which is the language of the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians, Arabic and Aramaic and Phoenician, many languages of modern Ethiopia, and some other more minor languages. In terms of number of speakers, the most important language in the Semitic family today is Arabic by far. It has something like 200 million or 300 million speakers. The next sort of biggest language is Amharic, which is the one of the major languages of Ethiopia, which has maybe 30 million speakers. Another Ethiopian language has called Tigrinya, has about 10 million speakers. That's Ethiopia and Eritrea. Hebrew is probably the fourth biggest of the modern Semitic language, with about 7 or 8 million speakers. And if we look or compare Hebrew with some of the other languages, and just choose some random words, you can see that Hebrew looks quite similar in terms of the shape of the words in almost all cases here. It's not to say that if you know Hebrew, you can understand all these languages, but if you know Hebrew and you want to study Aramaic or Arabic or Amharic, you'll find you're already, you have a pretty good basis if you know Hebrew already. And in terms of the grammar also, the way you conjugate verbs and the way you make nouns plural and so on, those things are often very similar among the Semitic languages. That's kind of my first important fact. Also, by the way, the Semitic family itself is actually part of a larger superfamily that linguists call Afro-Asiatic. In that family are the Egyptian language, the language that you see written in ancient hieroglyphs, a family of languages called Berber, found in North Africa, especially in Morocco and Algeria, and the Chadic language family, which is a large family of Northern Africa. Hausa, the main language of Nigeria, is in that family. And two other branches called Cushitic and Amadic, which are mainly languages in Ethiopia and Eastern African countries. So Semitic, this larger family rather of Afro-Asiatic is quite big, and we don't know exactly when any supposed common ancestor would have been spoken, but probably 10,000 years ago, something like that. So these have a very ancient connection, all these different branches of Afro-Asiatic. Now, one thing that's important to realize when studying any language is that languages are always changing, evolving. No matter how much we try to keep it from changing, and people do try, language is always changing. So if we look at just English, for example, for a minute, and I here have a couple of passages from Dickens from the 19th century and Shakespeare from the 16th century. If we look at these passages, even Dickens, which is not that long ago, the language looks somewhat archaic, with phrases like over yonder, and the word whittles here is a word that I don't hear very often. If we go back further to Shakespeare, the language starts to look very different, very old-fashioned, and a lot of words we don't recognize, and grammar that we don't use anymore. And if we go further back to Chaucer in the 14th century, English starts to look almost like a foreign language. And if we go back to Beowulf from the 9th century, Old English, it looks as foreign as German or Swedish, maybe even more so. It looks incredibly different from modern English. So just in the last 1,200 years, English has evolved beyond the point of recognition. Hebrew, I said, has been attested for about 3,000 years. So it's not surprising that Hebrew also has changed in that time period. And by the way, this is just diachronic change. I'm not talking about things like different dialects of English. You know, we have different, today we have Irish English and Yorkshire English and American English and South African English, and all different varieties of English by geographic location. And like English, Hebrew can be divided up into historical periods. So here is a sketch of the major periods of Hebrew. Each of these different phases is characterized by differences in vocabulary, in grammar, sometimes word order changes, pronunciation, we assume, we know has changed over the centuries. So Hebrew it's a language, but there's more than one type of Hebrew. The earliest phase, biblical Hebrew, obviously the language of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, is itself not a uniform type of Hebrew. The Bible itself is not one book, right? The Bible is a collection of many books written by many authors over a period of probably 1,200 years in different places. And so we find in the Bible alone different varieties of Hebrew. The language of the oldest parts of the Bible, things like the poem in Judges 5 or Exodus 15, or the blessing of Jacob in Genesis 49, those passages are thought to be the oldest sections of the Bible, and we call that archaic biblical Hebrew, and we just guess they were written around the 12th or 11th centuries BCE. We have no way of proving dates of anything. And most of the Bible, I would say, like the narratives in the Torah and in Judges and Samuel, things like that, are written in what we call standard biblical Hebrew. And then some of the later books like Esther and Ecclesiastes and Chronicles are written in what we call late biblical Hebrew. We also find in the Bible differences in dialect. So there's a northern Hebrew dialect and a southern Hebrew dialect that we can tease out if we look closely at the Hebrew of the Bible. So biblical Hebrew itself, again, not a uniform language. It's not that it's so different that you have to study them separately, but there are differences in different books of the Bible. You'll notice that the division between standard and late biblical Hebrew is the 6th century BCE, which is the time, as you probably all know, of the Babylonian exile. And that exile had an effect on the Hebrew language. First of all, the Jews that were exiled to Babylon were surrounded by people speaking other languages, especially Aramaic. And those immigrants, you can call them that, in Babylon, like any immigrant community, picked up the local language. And then when the Jews came back to Judah in the late 6th and 5th centuries, they brought that Aramaic with them, or at least the influence of Aramaic on their Hebrew. The Persians came after the Babylonians, and the Persians used Aramaic as their administrative language. They also spoke Persian. And in the Persian period, both Aramaic and Persian, those languages influenced the Hebrew language. And so slowly after the time of the exile, Aramaic began to slowly supplant Hebrew as the dominant language of Israel. So in late biblical Hebrew, some of the features that make it distinct from earlier phases of Hebrew are borrowings from Aramaic and Persian and things like that. And also we find grammatical changes in late biblical Hebrew. So from the time of the exile, and then later the Greeks came at the end of the 4th century BCE and brought Greek, and Hebrew began a slow fading away as the main language of the Jewish community. And before I move on to later phases, I want to say something else about biblical Hebrew. I said that the earliest sections of the Bible were written probably around the 12th or 11th centuries BCE, and the rest of the biblical books written in the next millennium, the latest biblical book written probably around 160 BCE. but we actually don't have any copies of biblical texts from that entire period. The earliest actual copies of the Bible that we have are Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest of which dates to maybe 150 BCE. So we don't actually have any texts in biblical Hebrew of the Bible from the biblical period, but we do have other texts in Hebrew from that period, namely inscriptions that were carved in stone or written on ceramic. And the language of those inscriptions, of which there aren't that many, is basically the same as the language of the Bible, but they're usually very short and nothing like literature in the inscriptions that we find from the biblical period. But those inscriptions are the earliest witness to the Hebrew language, physical witness. So here's an image of a very early text in Hebrew from about 900 BCE called the Gezer calendar. And if you read the text, it's not very exciting and not very long, but it's in Hebrew. Here is another famous inscription. This, I think, is the longest, if not it's one of the longest of the Hebrew inscriptions. It's called the Siloam Tunnel inscription, S-I-L-O-A-M. And it comes from about 700 BCE. It was discovered in Jerusalem in 1880, and it's now in a museum in Turkey. And this inscription commemorates the building of a tunnel around Jerusalem, and you can read the translation here. Again, not a very exciting text, but it is an important witness to the Hebrew language. And if we look at a drawing of the same inscription, what do you notice about the Hebrew of this text, or the Hebrew of this text here? It looks strange to anybody?
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourselves or to write in the chat.
I just recognize the bed on the description. The other letters are very weird.
Exactly. The alphabet looks almost nothing like the Hebrew alphabet that we all know. That's because in the earliest period, Hebrew was written in a form of the alphabet that we call Paleo-Hebrew. It's the same alphabet, just basically a different font, right? Different shapes of the letters.
I have a question.
Sure.
I have read in some books that the shapes of the letters in Hebrew reminds us to some shapes in real life. Like, for example, bet was intended to be a bite, a house, and ein, an eye, and so on. What do you know about this?
It's correct. So the very earliest alphabetic texts were probably inspired by Egyptian hieroglyphs, where the shapes of the symbols all represent real life objects. And someone had the idea that if you draw a picture of a bite, of a house, you can use that to represent the sound b, and so on. And so the earliest, here I'll show you now. Here, this is the earliest Hebrew alphabet. And if you look, for example, at the Aleph, Aleph means an ox, and you can sort of see it's turned sideways, but it looks like the shape of an ox head. Bet, I mean, it's not really a house, but it sort of looks like a house. And you have to use your imagination in some of these, but in an earlier period, these are kind of stylized or cursive forms of symbols that did look like real life objects. And it was the Phoenicians who lived just north of Israel, what's now Lebanon, who kind of perfected the alphabet. And this is the shapes of these letters are the Phoenician shapes. And the Hebrews borrowed the letters from the Phoenicians, and also took the names of the letters from the Phoenicians spoke a language very close to Hebrew, and the names were borrowed in Hebrew, but they're the Phoenician words. The Hebrews used this alphabet for hundreds of years, but then again, after the exile, when they were surrounded by Aramaic speakers, the Arameans also borrowed this alphabet. But over the centuries, they began to change the shapes of the letters, kind of like different fonts again. And they developed their own style of writing these same letters. And so the letters that we know as Hebrew today, what we call the square Hebrew script, was actually borrowed from the Aramaic alphabet after the time of the exile. So here's a little kind of family tree. The Phoenician alphabet was borrowed as the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, and the Aramaic alphabet gave rise to the square Hebrew script. Other varieties of Aramaic writing are the source of the Arabic alphabet, and the Greeks also borrowed the same alphabet. That's why the Greek names Alpha and Beta and so on sound like the Hebrew words Aleph, Bet, because the Greeks borrowed the letters from the Phoenicians. They gave it to the Etruscans who lived in Italy, and they gave it to the Romans. The Latin alphabet has the same origin as the Hebrew alphabet. Just in each case, they've been modified in some way. Here's another slide. You can see different varieties of the old Hebrew script on the left. I don't know how well you can see it on your screens, but the point I want to make, the important point, is that the Hebrew alphabet that we know is not the original Hebrew alphabet. Then for the first maybe half millennium that Hebrew was written down, they used a different form of the script. And then here, you can sort of see a little better in the second column, the Phoenician shapes, the old Hebrew shapes, and the next column, the third column, you can see the early Greek forms of these letters. And you can see a little better how Greek may have adapted these letters. At one point, Greek sort of flipped them around. And so our letters today have the same source, our English letters, I mean, have the same source as our modern Hebrew letters. They all go back to the Phoenician alphabet, which in turn, as the alphabet suggested, go back to some earlier kind of pictographic styles of writing. So moving on, from about the 2nd century BCE begins the phase that we call Rabbinic Hebrew, the language of many of the important rabbinic texts like the Mishnah and the Tosefta, and some Midrashim and so on, are written in a variety of Hebrew that's different than biblical Hebrew, rather different, I would say. The Mishnah itself was written down around the year 200 CE. But by that point, Hebrew was just about a dead language, or at least I should say, it was hardly spoken at all, probably by anybody as a native language. As I said, it had been losing ground to Hebrew for centuries. And in the 1st century, as you probably know, there was a major revolt against the Romans in 67 CE, another one in 132 CE. They both ended very badly for the Jews. The Romans slaughtered most of the Jewish population in Israel. Many others left Israel and went to other countries where they adopted other languages. So by about the 2nd century, Hebrew had died out as a spoken language. But it's not accurate to say that Hebrew was a dead language, because from that period until the present day, there was never a time when Hebrew was not used in some way. It remained the primary written language of Jewish communities around the world. It remained a liturgical language used in synagogues and for prayer and so on, even though Jews were speaking Greek or Latin or Persian or whatever, Aramaic, whatever language was current where they were living. So we usually hear that Hebrew was dead and it was revived by Eliezer ben Yehuda in the 1800s, the 1880s. And it's partly true because it was not anyone's mother tongue until the 1880s, but it wasn't dead. It was very vibrant, and there's a massive amount of literature from the rabbinic era, from the medieval period. There's a huge corpus of poetry, corpora of poetry from various places. Most, I guess, famously, all the poetry that comes from Spain and Provence from the 10th to 15th centuries. Poets like Shmuel Hanagid and Yehuda Levi and others have all kinds of poems in Hebrew. We have philosophical, grammatical, medical, scientific, astrological, historical, all kinds of other genres of texts in Hebrew written during these centuries when Hebrew was supposedly dead. We have Bible commentaries from famous writers like Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Nachmanides, halachic works by Maimonides. There's a vast amount of literature in Hebrew from the medieval period, as well as more mundane things like financial documents and letters, community records written in Hebrew. Just a vast amount of literature, most of it still unpublished. So even though Jews were speaking other languages, Hebrew remained in wide use as a written and liturgical language. So it was never dead, is the point. Medieval Hebrew, I put here as a phase of the language, is not really a type of Hebrew. It's more of a time period, because during that period, people wrote in all kinds of ways. Some wrote in imitation of the Bible, some wrote in imitation of the Mishnah, some wrote in more innovative ways. As all the new technology and advances in philosophy and medicine and things were happening in the Middle Ages, writers had to develop new vocabulary so that Hebrew could express these ideas. We have a real variety of types of Hebrew in the medieval period. Now, as we get to modern Hebrew, I want to make a couple points. One is that some try to argue that modern Hebrew is not a Semitic language anymore, but it's a European language that's been re-lexified. It's just a European language using Hebrew words. That's not true at all. If you look at the grammar and the structure of modern Hebrew, it is for sure a Semitic language. It retains all of the structure and grammatical elements of earlier phases of Hebrew. But modern Hebrew is not an evolution, a natural evolution of older types of Hebrew. It's more of an amalgamation of the older types of Hebrew. So in some ways, modern Hebrew is like biblical Hebrew. So for example, in biblical Hebrew, masculine plural nouns have the suffix im, but in rabbinic Hebrew, the plural is in with a final n. As you may know from the Haggadah, you see a lot of forms of im. And in modern Hebrew, we use only im, except for certain special words. The forms like zeh, zot, and ele are biblical forms, not used in rabbinic Hebrew. In the Bible, we find anachnu for we. In rabbinic Hebrew, they use anu for we. So in many ways, probably in most ways, in terms of the grammar, modern Hebrew mirrors biblical Hebrew. But in some ways, it reflects rabbinic Hebrew, unlike biblical Hebrew. So for example, in the Bible, we find the word asher used much more often. But in rabbinic Hebrew, we find the form she instead. And in modern Hebrew, she is what is typical. The word shel, like the possessive word shel, sheli, shelanu, and so on, is not used in the Bible at all. That is a word that was new in rabbinic Hebrew, and that's normal in modern Hebrew. So if we look at the grammatical features and the way verbs are conjugated and nouns are pluralized and so on, in some ways, modern Hebrew is like biblical, in some ways like rabbinic Hebrew. So it's a real kind of melding of those two phases. In terms of vocabulary, we find lots of words from the Bible, of course. We find some words that are, back to my slide, some words that are from the late biblical period. Here I've given a few examples. So common words like milah or sof, those are words that are not found until late biblical Hebrew. They're not found in the earlier books of the Bible. A lot of common words in modern Hebrew are from Rabbinic Hebrew. So words like Abba and Ima or Zug are words that were not known in the Bible that come from Rabbinic Hebrew. We find a lot of words that are in neither type of Hebrew, but come from the medieval period. So a lot of words are unknown until medieval Hebrew. Words like shadchan and mitziut and echut and kamut, those were inventions of medieval Hebrew writers. And we also find words borrowed in the medieval period, words like merkaz from Arabic or tarikh from Arabic, that are common words in modern Hebrew, but were unknown in the ancient periods. Almost all the grammatical terminology that we find in modern Hebrew, words like binyan and shoresh and poal, those are words that did not exist in Hebrew until around the 11th or 12th century, when the medieval Hebrew grammarians came along and created these words based on words that were used in Arabic grammatical works. We also find in modern Hebrew a huge number of newly created words, some from roots that were already known. So we find words like machshev. Obviously, that's a new creation because computers weren't around all that long ago. And but the root of the word machshev, chashav, the chashav exists in the Bible. Or the word tapuz, oranges, didn't exist in the biblical world. The word was created as a blend of tapuach and zahav, both biblical words. So we find a lot of new creations in modern Hebrew that are based on older Hebrew elements. We find a lot of modern Hebrew words that are translations, Hebrew translations of words from other languages. So, for example, tapuach adama, potato, is a literal translation of European words for potato, like French pomme de terre. My favorite is Parat Moshe Rabbeinu, ladybug, which is a translation of the Yiddish word, which itself is a partial translation of the Russian word for a ladybug. In Russian, they say God's little cow, Boże korovka. Agvania for tomato also unknown in the biblical world. But there is a biblical root, agav, which means to lust or to desire. And that was used to create the word agvania. We also find in modern Hebrew a huge number of borrowings from Arabic, or especially from English nowadays, or from Russian, or from French, or other languages. And so modern Hebrew is this amazing mix of ancient biblical elements and rabbinic elements and medieval elements and borrowings from all these languages with which Jews have had contact in the last 2,000 plus years: Aramaic and Persian and Arabic and English and French and others, and these new creations that we get from Hebrew roots. So modern Hebrew is kind of the culmination of this 3,000 years of history. And of course, modern Hebrew is still evolving. Every few months, the Hebrew Academy puts out lists of new words, not all of which get adopted, but they're constantly creating new words for things like flash drives and other modern inventions. So if we look at it, I chose a random Hebrew sentence I found in a newspaper a couple of years ago, and we can sort of tease it apart, and we find, some words like koteret comes from biblical Hebrew. In the Bible, it means the top of a pillar, the capital of a pillar, but it's used in modern Hebrew. It's been changed. Its meaning's been changed to mean a newspaper headline. And the word iton comes from an older Hebrew word et, meaning time, and it's been calqued from this German word Zeitung, which seems to come from the word Zeit, time in German. And so looking at just this random Hebrew sentence, we see kind of the history of Hebrew from biblical Hebrew through modern inventions, just by picking apart all the different words. So I guess I'll stop there, but just I want to make the point that learning Hebrew, you're at the same time learning the history of Hebrew without even knowing it, I think. So I'm happy to talk more about what I've said and answer questions.
Toda rabba. Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. I'm always used to learn like which words came from Hebrew to Yiddish, but I didn't know about Moshe Skiale Rabbeinu coming into Hebrew. That was really interesting. We have several questions already. So David has several questions. I'm going to read them to you, unless David, you want to read them yourself?
Oh, sure. How would Mishnaic Hebrew have evolved so much from late biblical Hebrew? How would it be so different from late biblical Hebrew if it wasn't a spoken language? It seems like it's so much easier for languages to evolve through the interactions of daily speech. And then related, how do we know that Mishnaic Hebrew wasn't widely spoken in the Galilee or in Judea?
It was a spoken language, Rabbinic Hebrew. It just died out by about the 2nd or 3rd century CE. So as Hebrew evolved in the ancient period, if we look at the earliest biblical material to the latest over that 1,000-year period, Hebrew does change, but not all that much. In general, written language lags behind spoken language. And so almost certainly after the exile, as Hebrew was being influenced by Aramaic and other the sort of upheavals of that time, the language was surely evolving faster than it was being written down, if that makes sense. It was evolving, but the written language didn't reflect that very well. So from, let's say, 500 BCE to 100 BCE, the written language doesn't change all that much, but the spoken language must have been changing. And then we have this period of upheaval, and then Rabbinic Hebrew gets written down, and this kind of chain of tradition has been broken, and they're now writing down what they're speaking. So that tends to happen in the histories of languages where the written language doesn't change gradually. The spoken language changes gradually, but the written language changes kind of in major ways. And if you look at English spelling, for example, it's so archaic, it reflects the pronunciation of English 500 years ago or something. So, and today the written English language doesn't reflect all of the spoken dialects of English around the US or the UK. So the language of the Rabbinic Hebrew dialect is a northern dialect, the dialect of the Galilee, whereas biblical Hebrew is the dialect of Judah. So the biblical Hebrew language is almost all the southern dialect, and what they were speaking in the north doesn't get written down very much. Maybe some words creep in here and there. And then when the center of Jewish life shifts to the Galilee in a later period, they start writing down their local dialect. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. That it's like light bulb turning on. Thank you.
Sure.
Is there a book on the history of the Hebrew language that you could particularly recommend?
Yeah, there's a couple of them. There's one from 1981 by a guy named Kutcher. It's called History of the Hebrew Language. A History of the Hebrew Language. I'm looking at it behind me. That one is pretty good, and it's more linguistic. It's not in the narrative history as much as it is kind of lists of words and things like that. Another one by same title, I think, by a guy named Angel, spelled like angel, Science by Dios. I can write this in the chat here. So the two authors are E.Y. Kutcher, Angel Sáenz Berríos. Those two authors have books. If you look on Amazon, they're both called A History of the Hebrew Language, I think. Those are pretty good ones.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. And I'm sorry, I can't resist just one more before I let other people jump in.
Yeah.
Do the other Semitic languages share many of the grammatical features of biblical Hebrew? Is there something like the vav hifuch, or is there kind of only the two tenses of complete and incomplete action? Is that, do we see that?
The vav hipuch thing, or the vav consecutive, as that's called in English grammars, that's no, that's unique to Hebrew. And the origin of that is somewhat controversial. But the tenses themselves, the two tenses, the katavti and yichtov, that's typical of Arabic, for example, and Aramaic. So yes, the verb tense system, the way verbs are conjugated with the forms of the suffixes, for example, look very similar in Arabic and Aramaic and Akkadian and these other languages. So,
Okay.
especially the ancient, the modern languages have evolved somewhat, but the ancient languages look very similar. Yeah.
All right. So I can't resist one more. If you were trying to argue that modern Hebrew was not a Semitic language,
Yeah.
what evidence would you bring to show that? Because I imagine that phonetic evidence is pretty weak evidence, since
people argue word order. A lot of the syntax of modern Hebrew looks very similar to sort of general European syntax. But the main proponent of that theory that modern Hebrew is not Semitic is a guy named Gilad Zuckerman, who's a very good linguist, a very interesting guy. And he has a book, I think it's called Israeli or something. I'll put his name in here. You can look for his books on Amazon. He's very well known in Israel. Anyway, it's I think that he's the minority of with that claim. That's
Thanks
it.
so much.
That's the Hebrew type. That's the Hebrew book. He calls it Israeli Safa Yafa. Other questions that were up there? Sorry, in the chat.
Yeah, we have. I can see a lot of messages in the chat, but okay.
I have a question.
Yes, you have. Yes.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you for the wonderful lecture and wonderful talk. I always kind of fantasized, because Hebrew tends to be in a isolated group, even though we say Arabic is close, Amharic is close. I just wonder if back then, when the Levant was filled with languages, was Hebrew mutually intelligible with other languages?
Thanks for asking that. Actually, I wanted to talk about that, and I cut it out for time. In the Bible, first of all, Hebrew was never called Hebrew in the Bible. The language is always called Canaanite or Judean. And the Canaanites, of course, in the Bible they're the enemies, they're the foreigners. But in reality, all those peoples that were living around the Hebrews in the Bible, the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Phoenicians, yeah, all spoke dialects of the same language. Canaanite, we can call the language, and Hebrew was just one variety of that language. And we have inscriptions in Phoenician, and we have only a couple in Moabite, and only very small fragments in Ammonite. And it's really just like London English versus I don't know, the English of Leeds or Yorkshire. It's just there's different accents, basically, with some different words here and there. So yes, Hebrew in the time of the Bible was just the local language. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. We will have just one more question, because we will have to go to the next part of the program. So Mari asks if there are other examples of languages which had a period of spoken quiescence and was then brought back to a spoken language, if there's any other such example.
I think so, not in the way Hebrew was, and not in such a successful way. But I know there's been an attempt to bring back the Manx language, the Celtic language of the Isle of Man. Some of you may know more about that if you're in England. But that language died out a century or two ago, and there's been some attempt to revive that. But I don't know how successful it is. Some Native American languages, there's been attempts to revive them and teach them to young children. But as far as I know, no language has been revived and become a vibrant national language the way that Hebrew has.
Okay, thank you. So Ahavat, thank you so much, Dr. Aaron. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And we're now going to go ahead with the rest of the program. So first, we have someone to present to us certain sayings, because as we did in the other sessions and we will be doing, we want people to take something from something about the language, something home. We want them to take them something that they can use or learn or something new like that. Afterwards, Rafaelo will show us contemporary poetry, because he has written amazing poetry in Hebrew, and we also want just to learn about new cultural things that are happening, as we will do with the Yiddish session next week. And by the end, Yoav will be singing us in Hebrew with the Yemenite pronunciation. So we still have a lot of things in our program. Thank you so much. And by the end, we will open breakout rooms in different Jewish languages for you to have a chance to chat and practice and have a nice time. That will be by the end. So
אנחנו רוצים לשחק קצת. We want to play a very short, you could call it a game. For this, we have a special guest. We have Julia Stoliar, who is currently the head teacher of the Cheder of the Jewish Sunday school at Wimbledon Reform Synagogue. And Julia prepared for us just some very basic examples of sayings in Hebrew, things that people say. As Shalom, Julia, Baruch, welcome.
Shalom לכולם. Hello everyone. ערב טוב. Good evening.
ערב טוב.
ערב טוב.
חג שמח.
חג שמח.
טוב.
can you see the screen? I hope so. Yes, you can? Great.
So we will present just some of this, and there's a blank in the sentence, and we would like people to help us fill it in. Let's see if you remember or if you know. Let's find out.
The first one is כמו דג ב something. So like a fish in
The water.
Yes, and I already see someone wrote it in Hebrew in the chat. So the expression is כמו דג במים.
זה גם קיים בספרדית למשל, como pez en el agua.
And that means someone who feels comfortable in their surrounding. This one is לא נופל רחוק מה. So something doesn't fall far from something else. And yes, so
התפוח. לא נופל רחוק מהעץ.
Yes. So התפוח לא נופל רחוק מהעץ. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. לשים את הדברים על
שולחן.
Yes.
What, Ima? Shulchan?
שולחן. So putting the things on the table is opening up the conversation honestly and openly. So
in Spanish, I think you will say like poner todas las cartas sobre la mesa. It's like to put all the.
Like all that.
But how do you say in English? All the cards on the table.
All the cards.
Great.
לא רואה את הדבשת של עצמו. So something or someone doesn't see the, how do you say the דבשת?
A hump or a hunchback.
הגמל.
Yes, which is the camel. The camel doesn't see its own. What's the word?
Hump or a hunch. Who can help us with English? I'm a Spanish speaker.
It's hump. Hump with a P.
Thank you. I mean, it seems to be that if the focus is Hebrew, my English sort of
flies away.
This one is נופל בין.
בין הכיסאות.
Yes. So נופל בין הכיסאות literally falls in between chairs.
What does that mean? The others, אני יודע בספרדית, הם גם קיימים, אבל את זה אני לא מבין. I don't understand this one.
נופל בין הכיסאות means that something is sort of falling in between responsibilities or in between someone taking care of something.
But would it be like, for example, you have to decide, there's an argument and you have to decide between one person and the other? Will that be it or not?
No, it's more like if you're responsible for something and someone else is responsible for something, and something in between this, sort of neither here nor there kind of thing.
It falls between two stools.
Oh, you say that in English?
Yeah, it falls between two stools.
Stalls, okay. So it's the same.
Two stools, S-T-O-O-L-S.
Okay.
Like stool in Yiddish.
Yeah, but I'm not sure I understand.
Like fall between the cracks when something gets lost.
Okay.
אל תסתכל אלא על מה שיש.
It's the half full and the half empty syndrome, isn't it?
It isn't.
It isn't?
It isn't, but I can give you a hint and say that in the English equivalent has something to do with books.
Don't judge a book by its cover.
Yes. So the Hebrew expression. Yes, literally don't look at the jug, speaking of Hanukkah, but what's inside it.
Great.
טוב מאוד. So, תודה רבה, Julia. Thank you so much. It was really quick and very, fun. You never know.
Good.
I mean, there's plenty. There's hundreds. You never know which one will be chosen. תודה רבה.
My pleasure. And it was fun to see so many of the same expressions across different languages, which sort of continues and expands of what Dr. The person who spoke before me told about different words, whereas here we have full expressions that sort of travel around, which is interesting to see. Thank you for having me. Have a lovely evening.
תודה רבה. Thank you so much.
Now, we want to introduce our next guest. This is a Barcelona-based Hebrew poet. I think it's better if he introduces himself a bit. Welcome, and thank you so much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you for inviting me. Okay, so first, thank you for inviting me. My name is Rafael Azran. Well, I'm Israeli. I moved to Barcelona 8 years ago. I was an actor in Israel. I did some acting, and I moved to Barcelona to study theater, physical theater, without no words. And eventually I end up with 3 books with a lot of words. So yeah, so this is my story.
Thank you, Toda. So we have here a sample of your poetry.
Yeah.
And what we are gonna do is we wanna hear it. We wanna enjoy the Hebrew. And then let's see if people can help us summarize at least like the main message of the poems in English. There is no translation into English of the many are translated into Spanish actually.
So what we would like is the author will read those poems to us. We're going to present them on the screen, and then if someone can give us a short summary, that would be great. Do you agree with that? Yes?
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share the screen now with the
which is the first one.
Wait a second. Should we go in a specific order, or the one that we have at the beginning? What do you prefer?
Let's go. Well, one of them I see that you don't have here, but let's go
we might have it.
Okay, for example, this one, Las 11 Estrellas.
Okay, Las 11 Estrellas. Wait 1 second, I'm trying to.
This song I wrote in Pesach, in Leila Seder. And the traducer, Ana Bejarano, which is very good and very famous here in Spain, she started to translate my my whole book that called Metro, Shirim Michutz Labait, Metro, Poemas de Fuera de Casa in Castellano. You see it? Okay. So, 11 כוכביה. אנחנו מתנשקים במרפסת הקטנה שלי בגרסיה. את שואלת, לאן אתה מסתכל? אני לא מסתכל. אני כותב שיר, אני משיב. על מה? עלינו. לשון רודפת לשון. נוזלים עושים אהבה בבניין שעומד על 100 שנה. בחיים שכל כולם הסחת דעת אחת גדולה. לרגע קט אחד של כוכבים וחג, היינו יחד. זה בעברית, לא ליאון קסטיאנו también. You want me to read it in Spanish as well?
Yes, why not?
Las 11 estrellas. Nos besamos en mi balcón de gracia. Me preguntas, ¿a dónde miras? No miro. Escribo un poema, respondo. ¿Sobre qué? Sobre nosotros. Lenguas que se buscan. Fluidos que hacen el amor en un edificio que lleva 100 años en pie. En una vida que no es más que una gran distracción. Durante un instante de estrellas y fiesta, estuvimos juntos.
יפה מאוד, תודה. So, will somebody like to just make a brief summary of the poem?
In English, I'll do it quickly. It says, we were kissing on my balcony in Gracia. You ask, well, where or what are you looking at? I don't look, I'm writing a poem. What about? About us. Tongues that look for each other or that search.
Chasing each other.
Chasing each other, that fluids that make love in a building that has been standing for 100 years. In a life that is not much more than a great or a big distraction. During an instant of stars and party, we were together.
Okay, תודה.
תודה לכם. So in this case, I use the theater because many of my poems I take from the theater world, and I do like a monologue or a dialogue. So in this case, it's a dialogue between the poet and his muse or his love, and yeah, and I wrote it in Pesach actually. Cool.
Great. So we go for another one.
Yeah, sure. Why not? I'm here.
This one or this one or?
Okay, the other. Okay, this one. No, not this one. This one, yeah. Okay, this one called Santa Maria del Mar. It's about the church Santa Maria del Mar in Barcelona, in Born.
Now, those that speak Hebrew, אלה שמדברים עברית, בבקשה, שימו לב, אלה שמבינים, those that understand a bit, try to pay attention so you can help us get some sense of in English afterwards.
And Santa Maria del Mar is a Gothic cathedral, is it? Near in the region of Catalonia. So it's great. Okay.
Very good.
Yeah. So I'm a tour guide for my living. I'm a chef and a tour guide for my living. So sometimes when I do the tour, I get some inspiration because I see a lot of things outside. So one of my tour, it was like a city tour. I take the tourists to see the city, and we always pass through the Santa Maria del Mar. So it goes like this. Santa Maria del Mar. ילד משחק בשלולית מים ברובע אלבורן, מרחק פסיעה מסנטה מריה דל מר. נראה שהגשמה עצמית לא מטרידה אותו, גם לא מה אהיה כשאגדל. אלו הם שאלות של מבוגרים. ילד משחק במים, רוקע ברגליו ספוגות הבוץ, צועד במקום וטוב לו. טוב לי גם. ההורים לוחצים שיפסיק, חוששים מביקורת ציבורית. כך הילדים מפסיקים לשחק ומתחילים לראות כדורים אמיתיים. ישו הלך על המים. כל ילד יכול.
תודה.
I really like that.
Would you like to summarize a little bit, or what was your impression of the poem?
Are you speaking to who?
Yes, Barbara.
What do you want to ask me?
If you want to just say what was the poem about and what was like the story.
Yeah, so this I really liked. Again, it's about a moment. So it's the contrast between the world of the child and the adult, and it comes very nicely to an end. So there's a child playing in a puddle and really enjoying it, not worried at all about what will I be when I grow up, and fulfilling myself and all the things that adults worry about. And then the parents are worried about criticism, because they're a little bit self-conscious about public criticism. They start pressuring the child to stop, and he moves towards a conclusion where he says that's how children stop playing and start to see. What do you mean? Start to see real bullets? Is that?
It's like I play in the word because
problems.
Like a ball, ball to play a ball and ball to shoot someone.
Yeah, that's what
it's the same word in Hebrew.
Yeah.
So it's like I say, this is how, or this is why little children stop to play like a ball and start to
I really
shoot
like the
each other.
conclusion. I really like the conclusion. So he says, and then sort of Jesus walked on water. Every child can.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much.
So
for
you bring it back to the church, and how every child has that spark in.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
Thank you.
Lovely poem.
Thank you so much. Should we go for the next one?
Yeah. The next one will be a bit long. It's called Provenza 78. Creo que I think that you have it in a Word.
¿Lo tenemos? Creo que no lo tenemos.
Word?
In Word, yeah.
¿Pensabas leer algún otro para que leamos ese y luego el otro o en lo que lo buscamos o no?
Okay, leo esto, sí, yeah, sure, I read this, no problem. So this is not from the Metro. This is not from my book. This is from my next book. It's called in English. Let me see what name they give it in English. Internal Migration. So yeah, so it's called קליפות. את בדלי הסיגריה שמרתי לך כפנינים במאפרה הכסופה. השמיכה עודנה על הספה, מסרטטת קווים לדמותך. קליפות הקלמנטינה על השיש מתייבשות לשובך. כשתחזרי, תגלי שלא הלכת, חזרת, כעסת. זה מה שאני אוהב בך. אי אפשר לקנות אותך בשירה. That's it.
יפה מאוד.
While we open the other poem you mentioned, maybe anybody has any question? יש למישהו שאלה או משהו?
Or the summary about the poem.
Of course, yes, sorry.
Yeah, Barbara, what about the
Barbara
summary?
did an amazing job for the last one.
Can you read it again first? Because to tell you the truth, I saw I wasn't muted and I panicked.
Okay. קליפות. את בדלי הסיגריה שמרתי לך כפנינים במאפרה הכסופה. השמיכה עודנה על הספה, מסרטטת קווים לדמותך. קליפות הקלמנטינה על השיש מתייבשות לשובך. כשתחזרי, תגלי שלא הלכת, חזרת, כעסת. זה מה שאני אוהב בך. אי אפשר לקנות אותך בשירה.
I'm going to need some help with this one because I can see some of it and some of it I don't get. So it's something about the changing moods of the girlfriend. Is it? So well, you compare, you talk about Clementine Peel.
Yeah, well, it's a hard one. It's a hard one because
it dries out.
Yeah.
It dries out on the worktop, on the marble. So
it's meta poetry. It's like a poetry inside the poetry. So it's very hard to understand it unless you control like the language like 100%. So what I'm doing here, it's like a poem about a girlfriend that left for, I don't know, for a few days, and the man didn't do nothing, didn't clean the home.
That's what I thought. I wonder because you say in the buckets, like is it cigarettes that I kept for you, and
so I explained it.
Ashtray, like what's this? Is that overflowing or what? Ksufa, I'm not sure. במאפרה הכסופה?
מאפרה הכסופה, it's like the silver ashtray. So
okay.
all the dirt that he left, yeah, all the dirt, he described it as something very, very poetic and romantic. But when she come back,
something. I think Haya has an idea as well.
Yeah, I think it's about the presence of something that is no more there. So there is a very strong presence of what happened, of this woman, of what happened to you together. She's not there, and yet her presence is very, very powerful and very strong, and everything reminds you of her, and everything.
Yeah, it's also, yeah, also this, of course.
Tada. So I'm going to stop sharing just so we can open the Word document, and we're going to read this final poem, and after that we'll listen to you. Thank you so much. And if you want to discuss something about any of the poems as we are finding the Word document with the last poem, please.
We're just
go
gonna
ahead.
open it. Meanwhile, if anyone has a question
for the poet
I don't think we got to the bottom of this poem.
No, we didn't.
You know, we've disappeared off the poem, and the poor poet is waiting for someone to say what it was about. It's something about the contrast between the drying out of the clementine peel and the way, you know, you can buy clementine, right? But the girlfriend has I don't know, gone, but on the other hand, he remembers all her moods, and he says, that's what I love about you. I don't get this final line, to be honest. That's what I love about you, that you can't buy. This is what you cannot buy.
Yeah, because the man described everything. It's a meta poetry. So yeah. The man described everything in the poem like it's like very romantic and very poetic, you know, like. But in the end of the day, it's not poetic at all, because because he didn't clean the ashtray. It's very simple things in life that we don't take care of them. He didn't organize the sofa, you know, everything is a mess. But this mess, he described it as a very poetic things. So when she come back, she anger because he didn't do nothing. So instead of get to the conflict with her, he said, no, this is why I love you so much. I cannot buy you with poetry. So it's like double meaning on double meaning on double meaning.
Did she stay?
Yeah, she stayed. Yeah. Yeah, she stayed.
Thanks for explaining.
Yeah, she stayed.
Okay, תודה רבה. יש לנו את השיר. We've got the other one.
Cool.
Vensa. Here it is.
Can you see it now? Yes?
Yeah. So this one, it's from my second book also. It's about a barber shop. I went to a barber shop to cut my hair, and I end up with a poem. So it goes like this. פרובנסה 78. בפרובנסה 78 אין חופש בחירה. לא מזיינים לך את השכל עם דמוקרטיה. פרנקו שולט. יש תספורת אחת לראש ותספורת אחת לזקן. אין אופנות ולא היו. בפרובנסה 78, בברצלונה, בירת קטלוניה, הזמן לא חלף עם הרוח. הזמן הוא הרוח. המספריים מקדש. הכהן הוא ספר, מבצע את מלאכת חייו בחרדת קודש. רק אחד עונה לטלפונים, לוקח הזמנות, חופף, מספר וגובה את התשלום. אין הפרדת רשויות. לא מקבלים אשראי. חובה להזמין מקום מראש. הספר נפגע כשקוראים לו מעצב שיער, וכבר בחפיפה אחת אתה מבין כי דורות של ראשים עברו תחת ידיו. הרדיו חלש, משמיע תוכנית אקטואליה בקטלנית, לא טופים ולא יער. הכניסה לאנשים מתחת לגיל 50 אסורה. מגיעים מפה לאוזן. כשהספר שומע שאתה מדבר עברית, ידיו רועדות. אתם מדברים את השפה שבה נכתב התנ"ך. אתה מהנהן בחיוך, אבל לא יותר מדי. תנועה מוגזמת עלולה לשסף את גרונך. בין עולם של מעלה לעולם של מטה, מנקים אותך יפה, מנערים את הסינר, מתקינים משענת לצוואר, ומעלים אותך קומה בכיסא. לפני אתר מרככים את האור במים קדושים, אחרי מורחים אלכוהול שמעלה באוב את אבא שלך. בהתזת בוסם, בעיר זרה, בשפה שרחוקה אלפי שנות אור משפת אמך, ילדותך חולפת על פניך כרכבת קלה, כבדה מאוד.
יפה מאוד, יפה מאוד, תודה.
Thank you. Okay, Barbara.
Anyone? Any shot?
Haya?
Yeah, I find it really very moving, מאוד מרגש בעיניי, במיוחד הקטע האחרון. אני יודעת על מה אתה מדבר, כי אני איבדתי את אבי כשהייתי ילדה קטנה, וזה מעניין איך שלפעמים דברים קטנים במקומות מאוד בלתי צפויים, מעלים באוב, כמו שאמרת, עולם שלם שאולי איננו כבר יותר, ובכל אופן ישנו אצלנו בלב, או בנשמה, או בשירים. כן, שיר נורא יפה, גם בעיניי מאוד גרפי, כי תיארת איזשהו מקום כזה, שאנחנו כולנו לפעמים מציצים בטיולים שלנו בעולם, משהו שלא השתנה הרבה שנים, ושייך לעולם כל כך אחר, ויחד עם זה מקרב אותך אל עצמך ואל הזיכרונות שלך.
תודה, תודה. אולי את יכולה לספר מה באנגלית קצת, כדי יש כמה אנשים שמדברים בעברית. אז סיכום.
Yeah, as briefly as I can, that first of all, I really enjoyed it, and I was very moved, particularly by the end of it. I mean, the beginning describes one of those, I think, institutions. I need some sort of okay from Raffaello. I don't know, am I?
No, it's okay. Yeah, you're doing good. You're doing good.
I need some confirmation that I'm not going on a tandem. So describes a place, one of those perhaps dark little institutions that one comes across when you travel in the world, and it's very foreign, and it's sort of stuck in its ways, I suppose. It's hairdressers, very old-fashioned hairdressers, where one goes to cut one's hair and trim one's beard in one and only way. There are no choices, there are no fashions. And so everything is very much, I've lost the train of my thought, I think. But anyway, the end is very extremely moving, because one splash of cologne water the writer brings back a memory of his father, which is sort of obviously very long gone, and of his childhood, which sort of floats through his or passes through him. This memory passes through him, like it's very lovely put, I think, like Rakevet Kala, which is one of those light trains, but at the same time carrying a very heavy, I suppose, meaning and heavy memory. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's
heavy truck.
Heavy truck, yes. So it's, I think I found in some other of your songs a lovely use of the Hebrew language, which I think people who do not know the Hebrew very well might have missed it. So it's difficult really to enjoy that. So there's a play on meaning and of words and on different sort of terminologies used very playfully, yes. And another thing I want to say that like art, and I'm an artist, I think poetry sometimes should be left not completely explained and not completely understood. And yes, I think sometimes it's good to leave it sort of a little bit open-ended. That's my opinion anyway. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
Was there a bit in there, because can you go down in the poem? So was there a bit about the hairdresser discovers that he speaks Hebrew?
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly the attitude of the hairdresser changes towards him.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah, is that
right? And I
right?
like that bit. That's the bit that really I liked, actually. I didn't, you know, that reminded me of something from my experience, and maybe other people have. I'm pretty sure, because Israelis travel widely when there's the opportunity, and you hear. And people hear Hebrew, and some people are other Israelis, and some people, you know, get very excited when they find out that you're from Israel. They get terribly excited. And usually people that are sort of, oh, well, I better not go there, but I better not go there. But when they find out that you live in Israel, they get terribly excited. You know, and I thought you were referring to that at a certain point later in the poem. Is that right? That you know, you speak the Hebrew, you know, the language of the Bible.
Well, in that case, the man who cut the hair, like the hairdresser, he realized that the
customer,
poet, the person, that he speaking Hebrew. So for me, it was something like very normal, you know, this is my language. We don't do a big deal out of it, you know, it's like, but what is normal to you, it's very special to other person, you know. So you say like, you know, I speak Hebrew, but you cannot do a big movement, because if you do a big movement, it might cut you with the with the razor, you know.
Thank you so much. I think that having like a little bit of history, then a couple of sayings, and a contemporary poet is amazing. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And I think that the organizers Germán, Bernate, who is here, Arturo, and I are very, very happy for you to have accepted this invitation. And toda rabba. It was really interesting, the conversation that followed the reading of the poems, to get to learn more about them. And I'll have to study them, because I'm not that fluent in Hebrew, but it was very, very interesting.
We're gonna have to buy the book. Hagira Pnimit, inner internal migration, is out. אני רוצה
לקנות ולקרוא.
Okay, I will save you one.
Yes, we have, yes.
We are going to finish our program with an amazing singer. So Yoav will sing for us, Yoav Oved. So Yoav is an Israeli musician currently living in London. He studied music at Royal Holloway and now performs as a freelancer in and around London. He sings at varied events ranging from opera to Israeli folk music and has performed recitals in London, Paris, and Riga. In 2017, he was awarded the honor of singing El Maleh Rachamim at the Holocaust Memorial Day ceremony at City Hall, London, and he will explain to us what he will be singing. Baruch haba, Yoav.
Hi, Tamara, Baruch haba. And Arturo, and obviously our connection at Westminster, which goes unmentioned. We both teach, work, and create the life at Westminster Synagogue. So Tamara asked me to do something related to Hebrew today, and I thought, what better thing to do? Can you hear me, by the way? Is everything okay? Okay. What better to do? But we talked about the history. We talked about modernity in Hebrew, but we didn't talk about dialects. We didn't talk about accents. We didn't talk about how the language is pronounced, produced. Hebrew in itself has many many varieties of dialects. What we think of now as modern Hebrew is not necessarily the only way of pronouncing Hebrew. We have everything from Polish Hebrew, which is Galiciana. It comes from Poland and Eastern Europe. We have the Yiddish way of pronouncing Hebrew. We have the Hasidic. We have all these different varieties on Hebrew. And I want to introduce to you one that I learned a few years ago. So this is the Yemenite dialect of Hebrew. A bit about Yemenite background. Yemen Jews, the Jews moved to Yemen since the destruction of the first temple. So this is an old community. Since August 2020, there's officially no more Yemenite Jews in Yemen. They've all been moved elsewhere for their safety. So there's now 0 Jews in Yemen at the moment. And so this is what's interesting about the Yemenite dialect and the Yemenite feature of language is that every single letter in the Hebrew, in the Yemenite dialect has a different sound. This may be coming as a great relief to those who say, but is it chet or chaf, kuf or kaf, aleph or ain? Which one is it? In Yemenite dialect, there's no problem differentiating between one or the other. Everything is as clear as day. And my grandmother would always say, if you learn to speak in this, you'll never have a spelling mistake. Thanks, Grandma. So I'm going to sing to you 3 songs today. Each one is a bit varied and a bit different in styles. And they're all going to be sung in Hebrew, which they might sound as not Hebrew. They're all in complete Hebrew. And I'll talk a bit about each one while we move through the songs. There might be some options to participate on mute because you can't sing together on Zoom. We find that out early on last year. So the first song is called Ahavat Hadassah, which is the love of Hadassah. Now, you think Hadassah like, oh, the name. No, Hadassah is the Shekhinah. It's another name for the Shekhinah. It comes from Mishlei, and that's the connection between Hadassah and the Shekhinah. It says, Ahavat Hadassah al-levavi nikshera. The love of the Shekhinah on my heart has been bound, has been signed, sealed. Va'ani betoch gola pa'amai tzolalim. And I, inside the gola, which is the diaspora, I descend into the depths. Yemenite poetry, and this is indeed, Shalom Shabazi. All the poetry that you'll hear today is from Shalom Shabazi, who is one of the greatest Yemenite poets that all his songs are profusely done and made and sung and redone and resung throughout all of Israel, in fact. And this Ahavat Hadassah, all Yemenite poetry, or at least majority, is relating to religion, relating to wanting to return back to the Holy Land, wanting that yearning of love for Hashem, for the divine, and the marriage between Torah, the people of Israel, and God. So this is Ahavat Hadassah. And I'll also be a bit of a surprise. I didn't tell Tamara this, I'm sorry, but I have an oil can which we use to accompany. There's reasons. I don't want to get into the reasons because we're on a language course. But there are reasons. And it's not relating to Hanukkah, by the way. Ahavat Hadassah lelavo v'nigsharo. Ahavat Hadassah lelavo v'nigsharo. Wa'ani betוך ג'לו פעמי סוללים. Wa'ani betוך ג'לו פעמי סוללים. לו ישרשות מיה לא תחברו. לו ישרשות מיה לא תחברו. תוך שערי ציון אשר הם נהללים. תוך שערי ציון אשר הם נהללים. שחרית וערבית בת נדו במאזכרו. שחרית וערבית בת נדו במאזכרו. ליבי ורעיוני בחשקני בחרים. ליבי ורעיוני בחשקני בחרים. Ahavat Hadassah levavi nigsharo. Ahavat Hadassah levavi nigsharo. Wa'ani betוך ג'לו פעמי סוללים. Wa'ani betוך ג'לו פעמי סוללים. לו ישרשותני לא אתחברו. לו ישרשותני לא אתחברו. תוך שערי ציון אשר הם נהללים. תוך שערי ציון אשר הם נהללים. Thank you. So this was Ahavat Hadassah. It was a combination of two different tunes, which I combined into one song. This was part of my recital a few years ago and at university, and I'm glad to be performing it still to this day. So the next song, now that you've had a bit of a dive into it, I want to do, this is Odel Eli, and in the Yemenite dialect. By the way, if anybody has questions, feel free to stop me in between, well, not in between the song, but now is a good time to ask questions or put them in the chat. If you
Can you repeat the name of the last song you sang?
Yeah, the first song is Ahavat Hadassah. Okay.
Yeah, because I have done Rikudim with that song, and I like it.
Yeah, it's a good tune. It's a really good. It's a wonderful poem as well. The second song that we're going to do has, so we've seen a bit of the oil can. We'll come back to it, but I want to teach you how to clap on the Yemenite rhythm. So, and we're going to be clapping this while I'm singing. So hopefully you'll have a bit of an experience to get into the music of the Yemenite culture. So the counting of it goes like this. We go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. That's basically, we clap on the 1 and on the 4. So let's go again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, who would have thought you'd be clapping in a language course? Wonderful. Here we go. Once more. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. Excellent. Now we're going to be adding a third clap, which is going to be falling in between the 2 and the 3. 1, 2, and 3, 4. 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 1, 2, and 3. Okay, I'm going to stop. Keep on clapping, and I'm going to start singing. Adaleli gonani surpo aliwi. Adaleli gonani surpo aliwi. Uhishma ogoli wayafika mamlali. Uhishma ogoli ويافك مملالي بسمو أغا وأخرو أشتاح هواي بسمو أغا وأخرو أشتاح هواي أسدين شواف نوع يحيد مللي أسدين شواف نوع يحيد مللي جليل مسكونך למה واسكونך לראשי מחנך جليل مسكونך למה واسكونך לראשי מחנך ואסיר רסון גונך רסון גונך ולשמו הללי הוואי זדים עלי סוני ורחבו סוטנאי הוואי زديم علي سوني ورابو السلطنة يا هواي الشيبانو طاني وهائر ملبي الشيبانو طاني وهائر أفلي جليل مسبونك لما واسبونك لغشي محنخ جليل مسبونك لما واسبونك لغشي محنخ وعسير رسون غنخ رسون غنخ ولشمو لالي هواي ودالي غناني سربو علي هدالي غناني سربو علي ويشمو قولي ويافك مملالي ويشمو قولي ويافك مملالي. Thank you. Great. So that was Odale Eli, and again, thinking about religion, thinking about blessing and thanking Hashem. The next piece that I'm going to be singing for you is one that's probably made the most famous and the most headlines around the world, which is Imnin Alu, is a song made famous by Ahavat Hadassah, and this piece of poetry talks about the gates of heaven being locked. The gates of the generous people around us. So Imnin alu daltei nedivim, if the gates of the generous people are locked, daltei marom lo nin alu. The doors of the heavens, daltei marom, will not be shut, will not be closed. And this is probably a good moment to think about what it is that we are shutting out of our lives, that we're not being the generous people good enough to be upholding society today. There's certainly a few things that I can think about for myself.
alu, imanin alu, dalatei nadi, vimedatei maromelonin alu, dalatei maromelonin alu. Elechai meroma, elechai marom, elechai merama, ma'ale karo, vimekulom beroho ya alu, kuhulam beroho ya alu. El hay, el hay. Imenin alu, imenin alu, imenin alu, dalatei nadi, vimedatei maromelonin alu. دلتي مرملونين ألو جلجال وقن رعشيم ناديم شبو ومقادشيم مزيب كبو دولو بشيم مزيب كبو دولو بشيم الهاي إيمانين ألو إيمانين ألو إيمانين ألو دانتين هذه بمدتين مرملونين ألو دانتين مرملونين ألو أها أها
Wow, bravo, יפה מאוד, תודה רבה. Really interesting, beautiful. Thank you so much. And such an opportunity to be able to listen to Yemenite Hebrew. Thank you so much, Yoav. Thank you so much. I do have a question regarding the oil can, so maybe you can share that with us. That would be amazing to learn about it.
Oh, okay. About why? The question why? Okay. Yeah, so in Yemenite culture, because they had a culture of mourning, they were mourning the destruction of the temple, the first one, then the second one. In Judaism, in the period of mourning, you generally don't play instruments and you don't have that music. You can use the voice and you can use so it's interesting why oil can, because they were using it's for two main reasons. One is that it's not an instrument, so it can't be classified as playing music if you're just hitting it and cooking with it in the next second. And then the second one is that the Sultan of the area forbade Jews from playing music. And so if they were caught playing, they would just say, "Oh no, I'm not playing. This is just an oil can. Look, it has the oil that I'm going to be used for cooking." So there are kind of two reasons why the oil can. They also play on trays, big metal trays. They play on pots and pans and literally anything that you can get your hands on.
Wow, really interesting. Thank you. תודה רבה. So thank you so much. I don't know if someone else wants to say a comment or ask a question and so on. This was like the last part of our program in this Festival of Jewish Languages by the Yiddish House London and sponsored also by the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture and organized by Germán Bernat Obando, Tali Margolis, Arturo Kerbel, and myself, Tamara Gleason. And as I said, just when we finish, if you have comments or questions, we're going to open breakout rooms. So you in different languages, Jewish languages. So there's going to be a breakout room for Yiddish, for Ladino, for Hebrew, for Judeo-Arabic, in case we have someone who wants to practice Judeo-Arabic today. And so we'll do that as well. And just to remind you that next session, we have our Yiddish session and our Hanukkah party. And after that, we're going to finish with our Ladino session and our like a siem, how do you say, clausura. how do you say clausura in English? Like our closure session also with songs in very different languages. So yeah, so thank you so much, Dr. Aaron Rubin, Julia Stoliar, Rafael, and Yoav for such an amazing session. And I would just like to open the floor for questions or comments. Toda raba. So Yoav, I did have a question. Your grandmother it comes from Yemen, or you said something about that, or?
Yeah, so my grandmother wasn't born in Yemen. She was born in Israel already, but her father walked. Her grandfather walked from Yemen to Israel on the journey. So yeah, but and the household and her experience is all Yemenite.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. So I'll be opening the breakout rooms, but thank you so much to all the participants, and Yoav, toda raba.